My personal story really is that I ended up coming to this church, Queen's Park, as a student because I was trying to find a place to park family car for free because I was a student at the end of the city centre in Glasgow, and there was one little place where you could do it. And I parked next to a guy I knew who also knew where there was free parking in the city centre. It no longer exists, folks, this place. But he then kind of drew alongside me, and I was struggling to kind of find accommodation because I was at college, and he said, you can have my flat because I'm moving out and my flat is convenient for Queen's Park Baptist Church, so you could go. And that kind of small event was what actually, led me in a particular journey. I knew not where I was going, and I knew not what the consequence of that would be, but there's a very small event that really shifted the course of my life.
Welcome to this week's Calling a City to Life podcast by Queen's Park Baptist Church in Glasgow. Who should we start with? Have I managed to avoid saying good morning yet, Jack?
Yes, well done. You have. Well done. I think this is progress. Although I've got a confession. Last week, it's good practice to listen to the podcast to learn and grow and see your mistakes.
Yeah.
And further into the questioning, I used the word morning twice.
Did you?
So I do apologise to everyone.
Yeah, I'm being evangelical about the word good morning.
Jackie, I listened and I didn't notice of it. I think we're getting.
Oh, bless you, Brody.
I think we're getting hung up over this. What time of the day it is? Thing. Needlessly.
I'm going to insert bird tweeting now instead. Every time somebody says morning, there'll just be like an insert. Ian, I assume it's good morning where you are.
Who knows what time zone I'm in here in this part of the world, but it's possibly the same time zone as you are, but not necessarily the same time zone as people who are listening. So wherever you are and whenever this is, welcome.
Interestingly, I was looking at the statistics, and 87% of the people that listen are based in the UK, which means there are 13% of people listening who are likely in different time zones. So there you go. Feel free to send us some information about what time zone you're in. I did think of introducing the show a bit like Band-Aid for those of you that grew up in that time. It's 12 o'clock in Wembley and 6 o'clock in Philadelphia or whatever it is. But we'll save that for another week.
That's too complicated.
Too complicated once somebody tells us. Now, we would normally at this point ask whoever preached, which in this case is Ian, to give us a summary, but we have a question beforehand.
Oh, so we do.
We do. It's an anonymous question, so for the purpose of this, we're going to call the person Bruce. And it's a question about paper. So this question, Ian, is they really want to know, it's a technique question, it's a technical question about your preaching. They want to know if you have a guillotine at home for the perfectly formed A5 bits of paper that you use for your sermon notes, or whether you take an A4 bit of paper and tear it into two.
Never been asked that question before. Well, thank you, Bruce, for that.
No, it's not. Bruce is purely a non-diploma.
Absolutely, but I'm calling this individual Bruce. No, do you know what? If there is such a thing as an A5 guillotine, can somebody suggest where I'd get one? If you can purchase A5 paper that goes into my printer, that would also be helpful. But no, I do A4, and if you fold it very carefully and squeeze it down, then it actually tears reasonably nicely. But I find the main thing is actually I find it's easier to read off A5 than it is off A4. So rather than kind of going up and down and starting at the top, going all the way down to the bottom and all the way back up again, I just go a little bit down and then I go up and across. So it's easier to read.
These are the parts that other podcasts just don't simply reach into.
But of course, everybody these days now use some kind of electronic technique.
It's so neat, Ian. I am so impressed. You get extra points for your fabulous preaching.
It's super not neat, actually.
From the congregation, it looks very, very neat.
Depends on how I'm feeling when I tear it apart.
I think this will end up being a bit like is it Radio 4 that has the cricket on it, and they started asking for cakes many moons ago and people send them in cakes. You're going to have congregation members sending in bits of A5 paper. Just to feel free to send the show cakes, but send Ian A5 bits of paper. Brody's strictly an A4 man, I believe, but turned landscape.
Yeah. So mine's folded in half. I don't do the rip.
It's different between hardback Bibles and softback Bibles.
Like Ian, I don't do the electronic But the kind of like the whole scrolling up, I like paper much for the same reason I like a physical book rather than a Kindle type thing.
Good stuff. Well, there you go. There's a bit of insight into the process, into how the sausages are made. Ian, give us a summary of this week's sermon. You were speaking on Ruth.
Okay, from my neatly torn up paper. The points I was trying to make was that it's all about growth, really, was my theme. And the sort of first point was that we do need to take personal initiative if we are to mature in Christ, but that's not sufficient. It is important to invite other people into our lives, to speak into our lives, encourage us and push us on, but that's not sufficient. The real agent of transformation is Christ and his work for us on the cross, in which he covers our past and invites us into his transforming grace by which we're changed day by day.
Well, I wanted to start by reflecting on a little bit on the whole book of Ruth before we deep dive your three main points. My thinking, Ruth 1 begins with tragedy and Ruth 4 ends with redemption in life. And this is an extraordinary redemption story, but there's also a quite mundane nature to it. It's not like the Joseph story getting the Tim Rice and the Andrew Lloyd Webber treatment. It's 4 short chapters. And I was thinking, at the beginning, the women had no great plan for how this redemption was coming about. It was very just putting one foot in front of the other, moving forward into their future. And I was reflecting that redemption stories and even great moves of God have the humblest of beginnings. And I wondered, what does this say about the often mundane nature of our own redemption stories that maybe don't include the massive miracles we want them to, but are nonetheless extraordinary?
Yeah, it's a really good point, Jackie. I think it is one of these stories which is a very well-contained, well-constructed story. And of course, like many other stories in the Old Testament, it does pertain to particularly ordinary people. And in this instance, it's more than ordinary people. You have somebody here in Ruth who should actually technically have no place in Israel. She is a Moabitess, and she is being included in the core story of God's people. So actually, even though her circumstances are probably reasonably ordinary and not that distinct from other people, there's something actually quite profound that's going on. And I'm that's actually true for all of us as well, isn't it? That whilst our circumstances are ordinary, the work of God in us is extraordinary. And, God is actually taking us from death into life and from exclusion into welcome. And so, you do actually see that in the story of Ruth as well, though it's played out in the ordinariness of life. And I think that's also quite important in our culture because, we often believe that real results happen, under the spotlight in the places of power, and transformation happens through some kind of celebrity experience. But actually, here is somebody who has a profound effect such that we're still talking about her today. And yet that process of redemption happens in a really quite an ordinary way, in an ordinary field, in an ordinary place.
Brodie, do you think we get hung up on wanting to know what the redemption needs to look like before we're willing to move forward sometimes?
I think we get hung up in the spectacular. And I think, stories slow us down. That's the power of a story. If a story draws you in and you become attentive, if you see details, you see things that in our everyday lives, the speed at which we're going through things, the plates that we're spinning, the things that we're juggling, sometimes we miss. And I think the power of stories and the power of one of the powerful things about the Ruth story is that it calls us to be attentive to those small things in our own lives. So for me, kind of like the story of Ruth and the kind of like the behind the sceneness of God at work in it makes me think of that passage that Edwin highlighted in his sermon of surely God was present in this place. Mm-hmm. And yet I nearly missed it. I can remember for a while I kept a diary. I'm not not good at journaling. I'm not good at keeping a diary and those kind of things. I know some people find those really helpful. We're all wired differently. I don't. But for a while, as a kind of young adult, I kept a diary. And if you were to have said to me, what's God been doing in your life? I'd be like, nothing. And yet I can remember looking back and just having noted down things that I felt that God had done, or answers to prayer, and I was blown away. I'd missed it. I'd forgotten it. Maybe it's not just the speed that we move at, but our forgetfulness. And when we think again of what's a big theme of the Old Testament, it's remember what God has done, and we're all guilty at forgetting or catastrophizing things and whatnot. So I think there is that real challenge of seeing God in the ordinary, seeing God in everyday, seeing God in the small things, and not despising that, but realising that, do you know what? Sometimes the small stuff is the big stuff.
Mm-hmm. I'm so guilty of this. I really appreciate that, because I think it's really easy to, as you say, get hung up on the spectacular or want the fabulous answer when someone asks you, what's God done in the last year? And you're kind of like, oh, I mean, really, the miracle is that I'm still standing this year. Or, oftentimes that is the nature of our answer, and we don't yet see that is in and of itself miraculous, and in and of itself a demonstration of God's faithfulness,
And isn't it true that when you look back, I certainly could look back to moments in my life where a very minor event or a small choice occurred, which resulted in all sorts of things opening up. I mean, my personal story really is that I ended up coming to this church, Queen's Park, as a student because I was trying to find a place to park family car for free because I was a student at the end of the city centre in Glasgow, and there was one space where one little place where you could do it. And I parked next to a guy I knew who also knew where there was free parking in the city centre. It no longer exists, folks, this place. But he then kind of drew alongside me, and I was struggling to kind of find accommodation because I was at college, and he said, you can have my flat because I'm moving out and my flat is convenient for Queen's Park Baptist Church, so you could go. And that kind of small event was what actually, led me in a particular journey. I knew not where I was going, and I knew not what the consequence of that would be. But, there's a very small event that really shifted the course of my life. And God was in that place. God was in that place, as Brody said. Yeah.
Amazing. I have my own little examples of that, which lead us very nicely on to the next thought, my next train of thought. You talked about your 3 practical steps that you sort of felt were represented in the passage. The first one being to grow, take action. And I was observing Naomi was motivated to take action by acknowledging the need for the circumstances to change. That's the beginning of the chapters. This can't remain like this. What does this demonstrate about our own responsibility to acknowledge when a situation is unsustainable, or even for a friend or a loved one to point this out to us and be willing to hear it?
Well, there's hope in this because, desperation is the mother of invention, or the mother of passion to transform, but there's risk in that, and there's pain in that. And I think for many of us, the belief that we can push through that vulnerability barrier, getting into the field, seeking to build a relationship with the next of kin, all of that was very risky. It was a step of faith, and I think sometimes we can find that we are in a place of need and desperate and aware, but we cover up that awareness because we don't want to face the pain of change. So I think just somehow allowing the desperation to be a motivation and to help people to press, because this isn't just you read the story and you can read it in a few minutes, but actually this is something that at the very least occurs over a number of weeks and months. So it's not just she jumped into the field and everything worked out. There's actually a persistence in this as well. So, when we actually uncover something that's challenging, rather than avoiding it or avoiding the pain, there's something in this story which reminds us that a consistent, expectant expression of faith, even in vulnerability, can actually bring transformation.
Brody?
I think as well, so Ian said about something is the necessity is the mother of invention, isn't it? But we don't all face crises like Naomi and Ruth faced. And I think that's one of the challenges, isn't it? Of when things are going well, when life seems right and, it's a sunny day and everything's good at work, do we then lose our passion to grow? When things are well, when everything's all right, when there's no crises, I feel in a good place. Do I still need God? And I think, we have a stronger, in one sense, we've got a stronger theology or spirituality of crisis than we do of wellness in some respects. And I think, the challenge very often for us is not that turning to God when times are hard, but including God, turning to God when times are good. And I think that's a challenge for us, of that desire to grow, not because I sense a lack in myself, but because I love God.
But I think there's also a place, I'm thinking personally, where you're managing at life, or you feel like you're managing, and it maybe feels like to open up and say that help is required, or to acknowledge that actually something needs to change in and of itself is quite hard, because that feels a little bit like failure, and you just want to get your head down, work a little bit harder, and feel like that's the thing that's going to get you out of trouble, when actually, and it maybe doesn't even feel like trouble. Trouble's maybe an overuse of the word. I just think it's interesting that Naomi is the one that comes to Ruth and says, actually, it shouldn't stay like this. There needs to be a different outcome. And I just think that's a very sort of lovely beginning. Maybe Ruth was thinking it too. I don't know. The passage doesn't tell us, but it's just quite interesting to me.
So is this an Old Testament version of an intervention that we'd talk about today? The Jews phrase, they need an intervention.
I mean, I think in this instance, the initiative and the persistence is with Naomi and Ruth. So Boaz and the rest of the family are quite unaware of what's going on. So I think, there's a whole kind of thing here about faith and grace and what's moving first. But actually,
yes.
I think one of the thoughts in my head really is that Ruth and Naomi put themselves in a place where they can encounter grace, and that can happen whether we're going through highs or lows in life. And I was just really struck by the kind of the rhythmic aspect of she's going out every day to glean. Now, every day we go out in good weather, bad weather, and there are resources in God that we have the opportunity to pick up or not to pick up. So it's not just that this is a crisis. There's actually, a continual commitment to go and receive what they needed on a day-by-day basis. And I think that's also a sort of spiritual challenge for all of us as well.
Yeah, the word gleaning sounds much nicer than the actual task that was involved. I suspect glean just sounds like a nice shiny word as opposed to what they were actually doing. One of the points which I found quite interesting, you started to relate this with a particular reference to the Toronto blessing back in the day, and it wasn't so much chat about Toronto in and of itself as it was about the attitude that says you need to go somewhere to receive something, versus the attitude that says, why do I need to go there? Surely God is exactly the same here as he is there. Now, not that I was financially going to be able to say I'm down tools and going to Toronto back in the day, but I can remember that attitude in myself of going, like, why do I need to go, as I think you put it, to an industrial estate near an airport? Think about going to Paisley, just, the bit of Paisley around Glasgow Airport. Why do I need to go there in order to receive God's blessing in X, Y, Z way? Why can I not just stay where I am? Talk to us about the kind of physicalness and attitude and the heart and head preparation that you touched on that is really involved in the travelling somewhere to receive, and how that relates to Ruth?
Yeah, I'm not a great traveller in that sense, but yeah, I think the reality is that historically there have been locations where God has been particularly at work. Sometimes people talk about thin spaces. Some of these are historical spaces, and people would even continue to go on pilgrimage to those places. And certainly, people would even regard certain church buildings as having that kind of a sacred space. So I do think there is something of that. I think there can be those places of intensity, and it has been historically documented that during many of the revivals that we've seen in the life of the church in the last several centuries, people have travelled to that and had a sense of being impacted and catching something, or people have also just been inspired by reading about something or hearing messages or hearing people who have been part of that revival speaking. And I mean, that is a part of a kind of revival tradition that has, some evidence. I think my own kind of experience of these kinds of things is often, as Jackie's already referred to it, sometimes these things are actually quite mundane and ordinary. And actually, it is just that simple. God is doing something, but it is something of that hanging out in that particular space for a period of time and seeking to be in God's presence that creates. So it's almost like creating an opportunity for God to work. I don't know much theology of that, but actually putting your place where you're taking the time to have an encounter with God or to receive from God in some particular way.
I was just going to say that I would have been guilty of the same position as you, Richard, when I was younger, unsurprisingly. And it feels, now that I look back on it, it feels like an attitude, it's almost Pharisee-like, of kind of, it feels offensive to us because, well, God says that he'll be with us wherever we are. And it feels, we take what we believe to be things and we sort of extrapolate them almost to our own punishment and aren't willing to see the wonder of, well, hold on, clearly there's a great move of the Spirit somewhere, so why would I not want to? I just find it really interesting.
And I think God can be at work in different ways in different locations. So, I've had the real, privilege of being in other countries at other points. I remember, going to India, the very first time I went to India, I can only describe the environment as there being electricity in the air. And some of the things that were happening there, just being really privileged to see that and to be inspired and to receive something of what was happening that you couldn't receive because it just was it had a very different expression or a very different manifestation to anything that I was experiencing here, and that kind of drags you out of maybe some of the cultural perceptions that you have or some of the experiences you have. It's a bit like we were beginning to talk about earlier on about how do you grow, and actually sometimes you grow by being outside of what's comfortable or familiar.
Yes.
Where you can actually manage and control what's happening. So certainly I have found in those kind of experiences just different things happening in different places that have been quite different from my own experience, and that has been really fruitful and really helpful.
Is there anything in our local church context that you think we can do to, I don't know, again, it's not the right phrase to say encourage that sort of encounter, but to bring the idea of what we experience by travelling and dedicating ourselves, taking the time out to go somewhere, to somehow reframing that for use locally so that we get the same kind of, I don't know. Again, it's not a sum, it's not an equation. If you do X, you get Y. But I think you know what I'm on about. How do we bring a little bit of that back into the local context?
So I think our physicality is important. We so we do physical things when we worship. We raise hands, or some people dance, or kneel, or bow. Our physicality is important. And I think the long journey can sometimes be a short journey. So sometimes it is that going to the prayer corner, that short journey of a few dozen yards or whatever. And it's not that God is rewarding that as such. It's not that, God's not some cosmic slot machine of we put the penny in and we pull the handle and get a kind of like a result. But it is in physically moving and doing something. We are engaging all of ourselves and saying, God, I am hungry for you. I am open to you working in my life, in a way that kind of like well, God, if you want to do something, you can come to me kind of attitude speaks of a certain resistance and pride and arrogance within ourselves, of actually saying, God, I know that you lift up the humble, and I am in humility. Not that it should be humiliating. Humility and humiliation are two different things, aren't they? Let's just say that. But that saying, God, I'm really looking for you to do something here. So I think, what does that look like locally? Maybe it looks like, as our response of saying, let's all stand, or let's do something, just to kind of like indicate, I am all in here.
We're good at standing in our physicality, but as I'm not sure how much we're good at many other things. And just reflecting on something Edwin said about looking around, seeing everybody standing with their arms folded, and then realising that that's what he's doing. So it's a really interesting, and I think for a lot of people, myself included, it's a real journey to go on. Maybe it's a Scottish thing, maybe it's just a man thing, maybe it's just a human thing, to go on to that kind of real physicality of worship. Now, that could be kneeling, it could be put your hands in the air, it could be clapping, it could be dancing. I look forward, Brodie, to you leading us in dance this weekend, I believe. But
no, those days I used to get dragged out to do what was known as the Penty two-step. Those days are long gone. And I think sometimes the physical environment can be constricting. So for most people at QP, kneeling, you're going to headbutt the seat in front, aren't you?
Yeah.
So there are those physical constraints of at times, though. Do you know what? We have big aisles, the space is at the side, mind the Lego bricks, but you can kneel there, you can come to the front of having that freedom. I think the challenge as well, isn't it, of that we then don't become spectators of other people. But that or that we don't become negative. So if you kneel in worship, that I cheer you on in that, rather than say, would you look at him?
Richard, I think your original question was also about location, as rather than position in worship. And I just think there are a number of things that are really quite helpful. I think we can always learn from others, and you kind of get in your own echo chamber in any church context, and you don't hear things, or things are processed in a particular way. So I think it's actually really important for all of us that we connect more widely, and that we allow other people who are maybe not from exactly the same tribe as we are to minister to us in different ways, whether that's preaching or praying or whatever, worshipping, whatever. That can be just really helpful. And I think God can use that because we become very acclimatized to people praying and speaking in certain ways and certain jargon. So I think that's really important. I think the other thing that we can do is create space in terms of time. I think we're all very pressurized and very reactive to what goes on. And I think if we are going to be strategic in our lives as well as in our life together as church, we need to take space for that, and actually being in a different location can really help. I certainly find, even very simply, even for sermon preparation, I find location quite important for that, just changing places, and then for maybe more administrative things, kind of being in a different place. But I kind of go through variations on all of that all the time. So I think actually physically changing your location can be really helpful in putting yourself in a different place for God to maybe work in a slightly different way from what you've expected or anticipated. And I think there are also great places in Scotland, if I can call that one out, if people like walking, be really attentive to the location, because, you know, we have a history of evangelism in this country that has named glens, mountains, rivers and fields. So if you go to Strathfillan, for example, you can see Fillan's Well, where Fillan baptised and healed the good people of Stirlingshire or whatever many, many moons ago. And some of these things are just hugely inspiring when you see that our particular nation has a history of God at work, and that's actually manifest in our landscape. So just a little kind of shout out for anyone wanting to go for a walk.
Or if you just want to walk where we live in Stewarton, you can just wander down Stewarton Main Street and imagine the revival from 16 Ump to Ump.
Exactly.
Good stuff.
I love the way you phrased it, Ian, because you said she puts herself in the place where grace and blessing can be given to her, which I just loved, is the way that you said that. And I think this is me going back to the Goodness of God song, and I do apologise, but when it's the part that says his goodness is running after me, I always think with that, his goodness is running after us, but are we making ourselves available for it? And I think, to me, that's a little bit about what this is choosing to make yourself available to God for something. And I did a trip. I went to Nashville, I went for a conference. I think a lot of the times it wasn't actually about the conference, and it wasn't necessarily about Nashville. It was about the fact that I made a choice, I put my money behind it, and I set aside time. And I think it does speak to the importance of making ourselves available.
Yeah, without being facetious, wouldn't it be good if we were running after the goodness of God as well, and he wasn't having to chase us down all the time?
Let's get Jen Johnson to write an extra bridge.
And then, but also I kind of think, you know, in ministry you tend to go to conferences and prayer meetings and all of those kind of things, and from many years ago, I kind of used to, and I still do this when I remember, you know, pray before I go, to have open eyes to see the thing that's for me. Because I remember years ago going to conferences and things, and it actually wasn't what was being addressed from the front, which could have been absolutely brilliant, but it was a conversation that I had over coffee. It was somebody that I drew alongside. It was somebody that I met that had something that just was really helpful. So I think you put yourself in that environment, but you also have to be open to the opportunities that God presents to you in that environment. And I think, you know, sometimes we can just be very narrowly minded about what we're trying to pick up.
Yeah, and in a similar vein, when I went to that conference, there was a seed planted about something that actually caused a lot of pain, and it wasn't until a year later that actually I found God brought the resolution to it. However, there were two further points, and I'm really taking us on too many tangents. You talked about growing and getting help, and you had the question of who's doing it for you and who are you doing it for? What's the best way about going about both parts of this?
Ask God, I think, is probably the first step. I would say ask God, don't be too picky. And yeah,
it could be your mother-in-law, is what you're saying.
I mean, yeah, my mother-in-law was that in many ways to me, so I'm very grateful for that. And that's quite a good example, because it's not always somebody that you expect or somebody that you particularly ask. And some people can be that without it actually being an intentional or some kind of agreed relationship. No, yeah. I'm just really saying that one individual is not necessarily going to contain everything that you require. And I think there is there's a tendency for us to kind of imagine some sort of hierarchical structure where, there's somebody who's ahead of me and somebody who's behind me, and, I'm kind of getting everything from the person who's in front of me, and I'm passing all of that on. I think actually some of the most helpful coaches, mentors, encouragers that I've had have not had that name. They would never describe themselves in that kind of way, but they've been perhaps more of a peer relationship. So one thing I would say to people is look at who's around you already, and see what they're bringing, but also be more intentional about your conversations. I think you can then also just ask somebody. I think people love to get asked. And often people, my kind of generation and above, we're very reluctant to offer that because we feel we don't really have a lot to offer. So that again, asking somebody. And then I think actually also when it comes to, who am I investing in, again, just kind of praying about that. But also a lot of it has to do with what we disclose of ourselves and our own journey. So you can have mentoring relationships that are maybe all nicely tied up in a bow, but there's not a lot being conveyed. And I think to some extent, if we are intentional in thinking about what we pass on to others, then those relationships can happen as well. So I think it's also about being intentionally open and intentionally thoughtful about how we have grown and trying to pass that on.
Yeah, I like the phrase, which I've kind of paraphrased, self-help is not help. That's just you doing your own thing. And actually you need some sort of external check and assistance. You can't do it all yourself.
We're built for relationship. That's the bottom line. And I think just as Ian was saying, before he would go to a conference, we'd pray, God, what's here for me? I think one of the intentional things that we can do when we're meeting up with people, and that can be kind of like, as Ian said, it doesn't need to be hugely structured, but of praying, help me discern Jesus in this conversation, in this relationship of, Father, give me a word for encouragement for A, B, and C that I'm meeting for lunch. So just that praying before we meet people, or as we're meeting people, of that we would know God at work in, going back to the mundane, God at work in those conversations.
I think there's also a mentality that's maybe a spirit of the age that we need to kind of detox out of our brains. And we live in a kind of social setting where we believe that fundamentally we are individuals, that we're radically separate, that the human being is almost complete within ourselves. And our task is to find ourselves, develop ourselves, and to do all of that without any reference to anybody else. And maybe then we connect with people. But actually, the state in which God has created us is one in which we are already fundamentally linked. I mean, you can get into all the physics of creation, and actually creation is fundamentally based on relationships and connections between things. But actually, as human beings, our culture tells us that we're actually radically separate, individualized, individuated humans, but we're not. We need other people. And our growth is absolutely dependent on relationships and being in company with others. Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of ended up talking about growth being part of our adoption into God's family. That's kind of how I tried to land the thing. And actually, one of the things that's really struck me in reflecting on what I'd said myself was that when we tend to think about being sons and daughters of the King, we tend to think about that as, I am a child of the King. It becomes a very individualized thing. But actually, biblically, the New Testament talks about sons. It's plural. So we're adopted into sibling relationships. So actually, we will not grow if we are not growing in the identity in which we've been made. we haven't been made and we haven't been recreated to be individualized, private individuals with no connection with others. We'll only grow as siblings, as brothers and sisters. That's what God has brought us into. That's our identity. We're not just a son, we are sons. We're not just a child, but we are children.
Yeah, that maybe leads into a little bit of what you spoke in the third point, which, if I remember correctly, was about there being a redeemer and the whole redemption narrative. But there was a particular, and here we go, it's Hebrew time. There was a particular goel phrase in Hebrew that you translated as kinsman redeemer. I am curious, and I think probably you've answered the question already before I've asked it. I was surprised that it's not just redeemer. Like, why not just say, this is your redeemer? That makes perfect sense. We understand that in the New Testament context. But no, it's kinsman redeemer. There's an important bit there in terms of relationship, not just a redemption one. Can you unpack that word a bit further? Because it's translated in many different ways. In my Bible, it's translated as close relative, not kinsman redeemer.
Yeah. I think probably it's important just to emphasize the word is a familial term, primarily. So it's a word that denotes kinship, connection with responsibility. I mean, it's not obligated responsibility. It has to be chosen. So and it was, part of the social fabric and part of the social justice, really, in a place where people, if they were destitute, would not have any mechanism for life and for living. So there was a family responsibility to assist and to help, to draw alongside people who were relationally close to you, and even to restore somebody's honour and the value of the family, such that someone would take on a wife, would marry somebody in order that their husband, if they had died, that their progeny would continue, and the name of that father would actually be continued throughout the generations. So, yeah, it's a way in which familial connections were affirmed so that people could live lives that were free with a measure of honour and well-being.
So if we are all related through Christ, if you like, then how does this apply to us in attitude now?
Well, I think as well of, so it's not just redeemer, it's kinsman redeemer. So that speaks to status and identity of having been redeemed, of I am family, I am kin. I'm not just a product or a thing. I'm not a slave. I am kin. So I think that whole identity thing, and it goes back to kind of like, do we sometimes get that in our heads? Are we kind of like the prodigal son who comes back thinking, do you know what, I'll just be a slave in my father's house? No, we are sons. So I think that whole identity kind of thing is a really important with the fact that it's kinsman redeemer.
And I think some people would regard the whole of this book as a book about the inclusion of somebody who was an outsider into the core of the family of God. So, you have a Moabitess who would have been regarded as being unclean and couldn't enter the house of God for 10 generations. Now, that's not what happens here. I mean, she is actually in one generation transferred into the house of Boaz and within the family of Israel. So there's something here that's saying that this action, which represents God's action to us, brings real outsiders, people who are really unclean, right into the heart of familial relationships, and that's kind of what God does for us as outsiders, and brings us into harmony in his family.
You had a number of great one-liners, I have to say, on Sunday, Ian. And one of them was, she can't release herself from her own history. And I find that really powerful. And it reminded me of Psalm 139, verse 5 in the Passion Translation. It says, you've gone into my future to prepare the way, and in kindness you follow behind me to spare me from the harm of my past. And this is the miraculous thing about the nature of God, isn't it? Is that he is the only one who can redeem our past and actually turn it into something completely beautiful and miraculous. And it doesn't stop at having been our past, but he redeems it in a way that we cannot comprehend. And this story is an incredible example of that.
Yeah, I think you have the sort of two aspects to it. You have this positional change, if you will, where somebody whose past excluded her by definition, who is brought in and given the rights of a child of Israel and the love of the family. So it's not just a legal transaction, it's a welcome to family. But then I kind of began to think a little bit about, well, what would that actually look like? You have somebody who's a complete novice in how to live in Israeli culture. And if you've been into any other culture, we all make the cultural blunders. We kind of say the wrong things, or we stand the wrong way, or put our feet the wrong way, or, don't get the jokes. And I just kind of imagined that would be the reality for her, and that her whole history was very different from everybody else. But yet God didn't just sever that off. It no longer disqualified her for involvement in the family of God, but there was a process by which she would be formed into a true Israelite, which is, what God does for us, that we are placed under his wings in Christ, but we then go through a process of becoming like him, or adopting the family likeness. And I told the story, so just a shout out for that film Lion, if nobody's seen it yet. I think it was on Netflix for a while, but just that whole thing of adoption covering everything, but then, and even covering that turbulent process by which we deal with the past, that our wrestling with our past history doesn't disqualify us from the adoption that we have received in Christ.
And that's part of the role that Naomi has in the story, isn't it? Of she's the one that knows how this whole kinsman redeemer mechanism works, how gleaming works, and all that sort of stuff. And going back to your question, Richard, of practically what difference does it make that we are kin? Is, it challenges who we exclude on a practical level. And I guess it flattens or reconfigures some of our kind of like social barriers. I think that the gospel, the kingdom, is all about taking down the dividing walls that separate us one from each other, so that we recognise our oneness in Christ. And I think at its best, understanding each other is kin. Is a helpfulness. Ian's referencing films. If you want to hear a powerful kind of like talk about the power of kin, then Gregory Boyle did a TED Talk on it. So if you typed TED Talk Gregory Boyle kin, you'll find that, and he'll have you crying and laughing within the space of each other. But yeah, there's a real power in that.
Mm-hmm. Great stuff. Well, we are bringing today to a close, regretfully. We could talk on and on, no doubt, but final word, Jack.
Well, why are you going to start with me?
Because Brodie just been speaking and Ian's got to go last.
To go last, okay. I should have worked that one out. I think my feeling generally is that we could stay in Ruth forever, because it's a short book, but it has so much in it that is of so much value. And I suppose as a woman, I feel the powerful nature of women making family decisions which feel mundane but are nonetheless mighty and powerful. And I guess I would want to encourage women who feel like they're stuck in, how do you say, is it mundanality? No, what's the word? I have no idea.
Mundanity?
Is there something? Mundanus? I don't know. I feel like I should have looked that up. Just to be encouraged that you have no clue, that none of us ever can fully comprehend the things that we just surrender to God simply every day, and don't know what that leads to. You know, there's Ruth ends up as part of the genealogy of the Messiah. It's just kind of mind-blowing to me.
Yeah. Brody?
Hey, so I guess one of the things that struck me about of just the way that Naomi and Ruth work together speaks to a challenge we face in contemporary society of different generations respecting and working together and learning from each other, and without creating kind of like manufactured kind of processes of just doing that of who are the Naomis that we need to kind of like learn from.
Great stuff. Final word from you, Ian.
Yeah, I'll give a shout out to somebody that we've hardly mentioned, which is Boaz, and just the way in which he represents how God accepts us as we are, where we are, with what we carry. God accepts us as we are, but praise God, he doesn't leave us as we are, but he works to shape and transform us.
Great stuff. Well, that is it from us this week. We hope you enjoyed the show. Please do get in touch. Email office@qpbc.org if you have a question, a point to make, or an audio clip you would like to send us. But that's it from us. I should give a little shout out to Laura, who suggested that in light of how we get tangled up in how we start the show, we should use the Truman Show to finish, which is no matter where you're listening to, and in case we don't see you, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. So that's it from all of us. Goodbye.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye.